Okay, so we're here on Thursday, September 29th for our monthly agent development. And today's topic is buyer agency and broker compensation. And so, I had forgotten to mention this earlier. So what I had wanted you to pull up first are, if you go back to the MLS homepage, so like not the Matrix homepage or transaction desk, but the actual NWMLS member site where you first log in. If you go up to along the top, there's a gray section with some tabs. If you go to rules and policies and you just kind of hover over that, there's Legal Bulletin 222 broker compensation. Click on the learn more link there. And then from there, I'm getting my information from the Legal Bulletin, but you don't necessarily need that. I think it's going to be helpful for you to pull up the samples though. So then when we go over those, you'll have those to refer to on your end. So since we're doing this online, I think that'll be easier. So I would recommend pulling up first the revised sample form 21. That's the purchase and sale agreement. So there's not really much on there, but it might still be easier for you to see it yourself. And then after you have that one open, also open the form 41C, the buyer brokerage firm's compensation addendum. And after that, the revised form 41, which is the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. And then last, the revised sample form 1A, which is the exclusive sale and listing agreement. Okay, so do you both have all of those samples up? Okay, good. So then, because basically what I'm gonna do is kind of go over the changes and then we'll go over in detail for these, how you would actually fill them out. Okay, so to get started, several MLS rules and forms will be revised effective Monday, October 3rd. So that is next Monday. The revisions further enhance transparency regarding broker compensation and create additional opportunities for consumers and brokers to discuss and negotiate compensation. The changes provide greater flexibility for consumers and brokers when selling and purchasing real estate and promote innovation and competition in the market. Now we'll start moving into the specific forms, and we'll start off with the purchase and sale agreement, form 21, which is the residential one. So it's similar on all of the different ones, but most of us just talk about the residential form 21 because that's the most used one. Revised Rule 101AI provides the buyer brokerage firm's compensation shall be paid, 1, as published in the listing if accepted by the buyer on behalf of the buyer brokerage firm in the purchase and sale agreement, or 2, as modified by the buyer brokerage firm, and the seller in the purchase and sale agreement. So you can see from that verbiage, it's really changing. It's about up to the buyer now, right? The buyer is going to agree to it. Of course, as you know, we fill out the forms anyway, so it's going to be at our direction. But the idea is that it's really the buyer. And this is why they talk about how this is going to create conversation around the compensation. And it's going to make it more transparent, right? Because it's going to be right on page 1. The purpose of this rule and related forms revision is to ensure that the buyer understands the buyer brokerage firm compensation and to create an opportunity for discussion and negotiation. The buyer's broker should discuss compensation with the buyer early in the process and should consider entering into a written buyer's representation agreement that addresses compensation and other matters. Brokers discuss and negotiate compensation with sellers when entering into a listing agreement, and similar conversations and negotiations should take place with buyers. If compensation is discussed and agreed upon prior to writing an offer, the buyer and buyer's broker will be able to easily navigate the revised purchase and sale agreement. That's because, of course, it won't be any surprise to them, right? And so we will get into, after we go over the forms, we'll talk about how you can have conversations with your buyers and talk about your value, what you bring, and how you're going to bring up compensation. But we're going to cover the forms first. So the way it works is there's a new specific term 16 in the purchase and sale agreement that provides for buyer brokerage compensation offered in the listing blank. And then there's a box to be checked, either pay as offered or other see addendum. The compensation offered in the listing will be auto-filled into the purchase and sale agreement from the listing or inserted by the buyer's broker if the autofill tool is not used. So I guess that brings up something like, as long as you're clicking the link to create a transaction from Matrix, then autofill should occur. But I know that there are some times that people forget to start there. And so they start in transaction desk and then autofill doesn't occur. And so then that's when you would have to fill it in. And then also I noticed just yesterday, there was a listing I was looking at, I think for a CMA, and someone had 2.5%. And it's like, okay, I know they meant 2.5, but what that means is if someone were to write an offer on that listing, it's going to be 2.5. And so also just be aware that although it's being autofilled, you're also going to want to correct it, right? Like if there's a typo, agents make typos all the time. So in that case, you'd want to change the comma to a period. So it's 2.5%. The buyer and buyer's broker then need to decide if the compensation in the listing will be accepted as offered in the listing, which is the pay as offered box, or if the compensation will be modified by the parties in an addendum. And then you would check that box. So some examples of when you would check the box for pay as offered. You would do that when the buyer brokerage commission matches your buyer's agency agreement, right? Like let's say, for example, you have 3% and it's 3%. Great, they match. You can check the pay as offered, nothing else is needed. Also, it can be done when the buyer brokerage commission offered is lower than the buyer's agency agreement, but the buyer has already agreed to pay the difference. And maybe you guys have already had, well, hopefully you would have already had a conversation about this and they said, oh no, we have that cash. We don't want to worry about negotiating it from the seller. We'll just pay the difference. So then in that case, you can do pay as offered, because then the buyer will pay the difference themselves. The other option would be if the buyer brokerage commission is over the amount in your buyer's agency agreement. So let's say, for example, you've set your minimum compensation at 2.5 and the buyer brokerage compensation is at 3. You'll see later on when we do the buyer's agency agreement, you have the option to check the box that the rate, any extra over the top comes back to the firm anyways. And so if that's the case, then that you can just check pay as offered, because then you'll get your 3. Yeah. So your buyer agency agreement said 2.5, but 3% is offered. You had agreed that if more than 2.5 was offered, the firm and you would get that. So then you can check pay as offered. So any questions about the pay as offered box and when to use that? Okay. Note that the revised general term U, so this is further on in the purchase and sale agreement, not on the first page, right? Remember, there's all those paragraphs that explain everything within the first page. So general term U provides that the buyer's brokerage firm's compensation offered in the listing shall be paid by seller as set forth in this agreement or any addendum hereto. If there is an inconsistency between the buyer brokerage firm's compensation offered in the listing and the description of compensation stated in specific term number 16, the terms of the listing shall supersede and control. This means that if a mistake is made when inserting the compensation into specific term 16, the compensation offered in the listing will control. These same revisions will be made to all the purchase and sale agreements, meaning that it's term U on Form 21, but it's going to be a different paragraph on the other ones. A new form buyer brokerage compensation addendum for we don't need to cover that. Sorry, I forgot. We can cross that part off. Because as a reminder, the MLS provides these forms and they're available to all Washington state brokers to use, but not all brokers are within the Northwest MLS. The MLS covers 26 of 39 counties in Washington, but there's those remaining ones that use other have other MLSs, but they may still use our forms. So that's why you'll see that kind of in some of the videos that are out there and stuff. So that is all that there is regarding the purchase and sale agreement. I guess we'll pause here, see if either of you have any questions on that. Remember, next we're going to cover the Form 41C, the addendum. So if you need to check that box, that's what we'll cover next. But any questions about the purchase and sale agreement? Okay, good.
I do. There was one thing though. I remember they were saying if there were overages, and maybe I'm making it too difficult even bringing this up, but like it could either go back to the buyer brokerage, us, or it could go back to the buyer, or it could be used as to credit a seller or something. I mean, but would you say that most likely the overages will come back to the buyer brokerage?
Well, that's how I'm planning to work.
Okay,
yes.
Okay.
So it depends on what you're going to set your minimum at and how you're going to work that. But when we get to the buyer's agency agreement, I'm going to show you how I'm planning to use it and how I think it's going to be easiest for you to use it as a way to ensure that you're at least making what I am seeking as a firm for a minimum compensation of 2.5%, right? And I've always, and so, you know, you've both had training with me at different times, but you probably both remember that when we've talked about buyer's agency agreements, I typically sign them or talk about a minimum of 2.5, but I start out by saying, I actually prefer to work for 3%, but because there's a variance in buyer brokerage commissions, I'm willing to accept 2.5%, but I'm not able to accept any less than that. And so then that sets the stage for anything over 2.5% to still come to the firm and you. And that's what I would recommend, because I think that that's going to be the best way to try to stand for a higher compensation for ourselves. I think that, I guess as kind of an example, just yesterday I was looking on some listings for the same CMA, and in addition to the 2.5%, I saw 2.25, and I also saw 2. So commissions are definitely varying. However, I will say, this was mentioned last week in Spokane, that Annie and others don't necessarily foresee a whole bunch of sellers starting to pay less than 2.5 or 3% again. But of course, it's all going to depend on us, right? And our colleagues, and how do they have conversations with sellers? And that's been a big part of this, is that as listing brokers, when we're taking a listing, we need to ensure that sellers understand, yes, they can technically offer no commission to a buyer brokerage and make it on the MLS right now. There is no required minimum compensation, but if they're listed and they have a buyer brokerage commission of 0%, they're basically requiring every buyer that's interested in that property to pay their buyer's agent. And the vast majority of buyers do not have money to pay for a down payment, their closing costs, and their buyer's agent. And this was asked last week, and I think, you know, it's been talked about. People have been hoping that the financing industry may change and there may become a way for buyers to finance their buyer's agent fee, but that does not appear to be on the horizon. So for now, especially for VA, because VA loans don't allow a buyer to pay their buyer's agent fee, it all needs to be negotiated with the seller. And so, of course, often it can be added in the form of a purchase price, right? Like somehow you bump up the price if the buyer needs help with closing costs. But then, of course, you've got to do your research and make sure that it can appraise. And so that's where I think it's going to be extremely difficult for VA buyers, because, well, we have to hope that they have some money to at least go towards their closing costs, right? The more they can cover for themselves, the less they're requesting the seller to concede, the better. Because there are beginning to be issues with appraisals now. That's kind of becoming a trend. I know for me, myself, I had a shockingly low one recently that really was kind of out of line, but that's sort of what's happening now in the shifting market too. Every time the market shifts like this, appraisers are kind of in the same boat we are with pricing, and things can be high on target or low sometimes. So just things to be aware of. And I guess I'll throw out there, has been talked about a lot in various meetings and at the conference last week too. There's talk about, well, is all of this creating discrimination or fair housing issues and all of that? And people can understand how people may think that, but that isn't what this is about. This is all about how buyers agents provide a service, and we've been paid in the past, and now it's just becoming more transparent about how we're getting paid. And if buyers need to start making up a difference or paying for our services, then that's just the way it is. We obviously can't work for free or reduce our fees, especially with inflation and everything affecting us as well as everyone else that's buying homes, right? So there's been talk about that, but that isn't really the issue. It's just more about how we're paid and how we need to make sure that our compensation is showing either on the seller's side, if necessary, for FHA and VA buyers, or that if a buyer needs to pay, say, a 0.5% difference, like I think I've told you both of my buyers have had to do in the past, that their lender allows it. So a lot of it is just communicating with the lender, finding out what they allow and working with that.
I might be getting ahead of myself, but like when they were talking about at that meeting, and I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but like with the settlement statements and making sure that like buyer brokerage fees have to be in the seller's column, because if they're in the buyer's column, then you won't get paid for certain things.
Right.
And
yeah, so it's a matter of communicating with the lender and finding out what they allow. Like for sure, VA and many FHA, they won't allow it to come from the buyer. It's got to come from the seller side. So then in that case, it's got to be negotiated with the seller. Price adjusted to cover it or whatever. It's typically only conventional buyers that have a down payment and their own closing costs where it'll be fine. I mean, that's when it was fine for me. So buyers, it can come off the buyer's side. I think in the videos and in the trainings, Annie's been really firm about it being on the seller side. But there are times it can be on the buyer's side too. You've just got to check with the officer.
I've never done like a listing before. And I mean, now when you set your listing price, you look at your comps and everything. Now I know this is probably sounds silly, but do sellers think about like what that commission and trying to work that into their selling price at all? I mean, I know that sounds weird, but
no, I mean, I guess there might be a small percentage that do, but usually it's working backwards for them. So like market value is determined by what other buyers have paid, right? Or other comparables that are on the market. So that's why we do a comparative market analysis. Commission isn't a part of that equation. Where it sometimes does become part of it for a seller's, if you run an estimated closing cost and net sheet for them, and they realize, oh, wait a minute, okay, with the title and escrow fees and excise tax is sometimes a shocker for them too, right? And then the commissions, maybe they realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm not going to net what I need to or whatever, right? Like, I know I've talked to you, Jessica, about my Rambler and Federal Way, right? Like they have a particular amount they need to net in order to make the move to Idaho. Right. So then in that case, like, and they've asked me to reduce the commission even more. And I'm like, no. And I've even used the other listings. Like one was recently listed at 3%. I'm like, look, there's other ones out there at 3%. We need to be offering something competitive. Otherwise, we're going to even shorten our buyer pool, you know? And so that's where sometimes commissions come into it, but really the conversation with sellers needs to be that buyers agents are out there showing homes, helping their buyers determine what to offer, writing an offer, negotiating with us, helping their buyer through the inspection, all that sort of stuff. They're looking for compensation, and we need to offer them kind of the going rate, you know? And that's where rates are different in different areas. You know, in Pierce County, it's typically 2.5% for each side. I know when I first started down there, I was doing 3 on each side, and it kind of worked. So I still try to do that, but it depends. If I get on and almost all of the listings in my CMA I can see are 2.5%, then I know then I probably need to be competitive, right? In King County, it's been a majority of 3%, but that's where I'm beginning to see some variance with that now too. There's a lot more 2.5% that we've been seeing during the hot market the last couple of years. And then that's where I've seen even some 2.25%, 2s, or even lower. So, and part of that I think will also change with the market, because as the market changes, and if it continues to slow and there's less buyer demand, then that's when we may see our commission rates go up, right? Because part of all of this is that what sellers need to understand is that the rate that they're offering needs to really be competitive with others. Otherwise, that's going to become a negotiating or a negotiated term. And that's part of what also buyers agents need to realize is that if the buyer brokerage commission doesn't match, then it's not a big deal. It just needs to be negotiated. And if the seller won't negotiate it and the buyer can't pay it, then some agents are like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Well, then you didn't come to an agreement, right? Like compensation is a term that can be negotiated just like everything else in the purchase and sale agreement, right? Like the biggest term that's negotiated is price, but sometimes it's earnest money, closing date type of financing, money down, inspection contingency, right? There's all those things that we fill in. Those are all terms that are negotiable. And so we have to remember that our buyer brokerage compensation now is just another term that can be negotiated. It doesn't need to be kind of a whole big deal. And if we don't reach an agreement, we don't reach an agreement. We have to move on.
Yeah, because I know that people were freaking out. They're like, oh, I'm going to have to reduce my commission to make the deal. And they're like, well, you don't value your services if you think that you need to reduce your commission. You know, it's like if that doesn't get met, you move on.
Right, exactly. Because it's just like if price, and I've had deals not come together over a couple thousand before. So you don't come together, you know?
And correct me if I'm wrong, but nothing is actually changing about compensation except that it's more transparent on the forms.
Correct.
But the process is all still the same as it always has been. It was always negotiable. It's just making it so that it's making it easier for the buyers and the sellers to understand how the agents are getting compensated.
Yes.
It's almost easier for us rather than like only dealing with it when it's an issue. It's dealing with it before it becomes an issue.
Yes. And that's where we've been headed since October 2019, but the changes weren't substantial enough. So I think there were, well, I don't remember how many were in this room, but I was in this room during this lunch. And the question was, how many of you currently use buyer's agency agreements? And only a few of us stood up. So it's really very sad. So unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people that haven't been using the opportunity to have more conversations. Now, unfortunately, this is going to force it where we all have to have the conversations. But they're good conversations to have. Like, I've never understood, you know, like people have advertised their buyer's agency services as free and blah, blah, blah. And now, you know, the National Association of Realtors doesn't allow that. But it's like, I don't know why anybody would have ever said that to begin with. Like, And so I'm glad that that's now been deemed deceptive, because it was deceptive. Our services were never free. And so I think that at least this is clarifying everything now, you know? And I think it's better, like, it may weed out some brokers that don't value their services or can't explain them. But I think if anything, it's going to help buyers really understand our value, because like, I've never had anyone say to me, when I've talked about how I work for 3, but I'll accept 2.5. But you know, if there's anything less than that, then I'm going to need to try to negotiate with the seller, or I'm going to need to pay. Everyone's like, oh yeah, no problem. So that's the way I think it can, well, I know it can be, and that's the way I think it should be, is if you've done a good job of explaining the services that you provide and your value, there isn't going to be any question about it. Just like I think I've told you both, I very rarely get any objections to the commission rate that I set, whether it be 5 or 6% when I'm taking a listing. There's just no question. I think that I've explained so many things about what I'm doing for them in the process. Hopefully they would feel kind of crazy asking me for a discount. They probably know from how I've presented myself and all of the information that is not an option.
Yep.
And that's how we just need to do it with buyers too. This is our fee. If, you know, and I guess what I should say is, I know that there are some buyers out there that shop by price, right? Like, there is a difference between Walmart, Nordstrom, and everything in the middle. And so there may be some buyers out there that don't value services. Who knows? Maybe they're really into the Redfin app, and they're going to use that app, and they don't need our help with the search or whatever. Well, then that's fine. Then we're probably not the agent for them, you know? And so again, I know I've talked in the past about how we aren't going to necessarily get 100% of the sellers or listings we go for. We may not get 100% of the buyers we meet with either. It's not always a good fit, and that's fine. It's in the long run better to work with people that value our services and that we're able to connect and build a relationship with anyways, because those are the people that we're going to be able to get referrals from and build our business on in the future anyways. Do you really want to work with someone that doesn't value your service? And then are you going to want to receive their referrals from more people that don't really want to pay you what you're worth either? Probably not. I found that agents that begin to discount their services end up discounting them for everybody, and they just end up working for less, because word does get out. So this was kind of all off script, but I think good discussion to have.
Yep.
Right? Anything else before we move on to the Form 41C? Okay, so the buyer brokerage firm's compensation addendum, Form 41C, will be revised to include additional options regarding compensation. If in new specific term 16 on Form 21 or the purchase and sale agreement, the buyer and buyer's broker do not select the pay as offered, but rather select other, see addendum, Form 41C may be used to modify the buyer broker's compensation. And I haven't decided yet, but I will probably leave the Form 41C within the forms section of all the transactions, just as kind of a reminder. Like, it's been sitting there always as a reminder when you use the office template as like, okay, does the commission match, you know, what you've been hoping for or whatever. And now it can serve as a reminder of, okay, does it match or not? And if it does, great, then you can just delete it out, but then it'll be there if you need it. And of course, hopefully 95 to 99% of the time you don't need it, but maybe it'll just serve as a reminder, you know, and then maybe in 6 months or a year or so, I'll pull it out of there, because hopefully then it'll all become habit. I just know it might take us some time to kind of get used to this. The existing options in Form 41C will remain in the form. This includes requesting compensation in a FSBO transaction, or where the seller has not offered compensation in the listing. Of course, we rarely see that, but that's technically an option now. This also includes the provision where a buyer and buyer's broker may request additional compensation based on the terms of a buyer representation agreement. So very important here is that the requirement to provide the seller with a copy of the buyer representation agreement has been removed from Form 41C and also Rule 104D. Providing the buyer representation agreement to the seller is unnecessary as the buyer initials Form 41C requesting the increased compensation for the buyer brokerage firm. So in the past, I don't think either of you had experience with this, but I know I did. When you used this form, you had to also include a copy of your buyer agency agreement. So you might be hearing agents talking about that. That has been removed. I know I was in an after hours meeting with some agents and they were talking about, no, it's still there. I'm like, no, it's not. So there's definitely confusion about that. And so that's why I want to bring it up is you do not include a copy of your buyer agency agreement. That's because that's your agreement with your buyer. It is no business of the sellers. You have this addendum that your buyer is initialing and then the seller will also initial. So that is all that is necessary. Additional options have been added to Form 41C to enable the buyer brokerage firm to reduce its compensation and have the seller credit the amount of the reduction to the buyer's obligations at closing. Note that such credit is subject to approval by the buyer's lender. So that's another reason why it can be kind of messy. If say your minimum is at 2.5 and you've agreed to credit the buyer any overage, well, that's got to be okay by the lender too. Another new option in the form is a simple reduction in the buyer brokerage compensation paid to the firm. This option could be used in situations where a buyer or buyer's broker agreed to take a lesser amount of compensation in a buyer representation agreement or a reduction to make the buyer's offer more competitive. So that's where I know in a listing that I had in the hot market in Pierce County, where I had it listed at 6 and was offering a buyer brokerage commission of 3. I'll never forget how one of the agents tried to make their offer more competitive by reducing their commission to 2.5. And I remember even the seller was saying, why did they do that? And I'm like, well, it increased your price by 0.5%. They're like, oh, okay. Like they didn't understand why this buyer's broker was doing that. I felt kind of bad for that agent. They didn't end up winning anyways. So it was kind of sad, but at least they tried that. So I guess it is technically an option that you could do in a really hot seller's market like we've had the last 2 years, but I didn't do that necessarily. I don't necessarily think it's needed, you know, and with the way our market's headed and how it's really cooling down, I don't think that's going to be needed either. As I said, of course, there's no way, like even Annie was saying, we don't have crystal balls. But we don't necessarily expect commission rates to go down, especially in this cooling market. If anything, they might come up. Sellers may need to start offering higher compensation to get more eyeballs, more buyers looking at their properties. Okay, note that the revised Form 41C provides a signature block for the buyer's broker. Some firms may have policies that would require the designated broker or branch manager to agree to any buyer credits or compensation reductions. That issue should be addressed by the firm's office policies. And so as a reminder, it's in our office policy manual, the most recent one that you both signed, that the minimum compensation that I was just kind of in general approved is 2.5%. That if you are agreeing to anything less than 2.5%, or if say you're agreeing to 2.5%, but then there's some sort of other credit to the buyer for something or a home warranty program you're purchasing or part of a repair to a contractor or something, there's anything less than 2.5% coming to the office, then you would need to have talked to me about it and I would have needed to provide approval for it. I'm not going to require that my signature be on that Form 41C. You know, obviously I have to trust you all to begin to fill out the forms. So obviously when I'm reviewing your forms, when it's your first several offers or one after a long time, then I'll be checking that myself anyways. But otherwise I'm going to trust you all to take care of your own commission. Any questions about that? Finally, there may be situations where a buyer or buyer's broker do not want to include certain compensation modifications, such as buyer credits, in the purchase and sale agreement. In that case, the buyer and buyer's broker may accept the compensation offered in the listing and address the credit in a separate agreement that is not part of the purchase and sale agreement. Of course, this type of arrangement must be approved by the buyer's lender and communicated to the closing agent so the applicable adjustments can be made. And the only example I can think of that is maybe for some reason it can't be in the purchase and sale agreement, but we would do it on a commission disbursement form. But I guess this is where I'll remind you all that we have to remember that we pay B&O tax on the commission that is earned. So say in these examples, you've agreed to work for a minimum of 2.5, but you're going to credit the buyer the other 0.5%, say, because it's listed at 3, right? Well, the office is going to need to pay B&O tax 1.5% of that 3%, not just the 2.5% that we're getting. So that's one of the reasons why I feel like it's better to just send it to our office anyways. We're going to be paying tax on it. So just keep that in mind, because if we are paying, say you're giving your buyer that 0.5%, but we need to pay B&O tax on the whole 3 versus 2.5, right? Then when I take care of our office disbursement, right? You know how you get the spreadsheet with everything broken out? You'll see that I'm going to have calculated the B&O tax off of that 3 instead of 2.5. So more is going to be withheld because I'm going to need to pay that to the Department of Revenue. So keep that in mind. And then also, I think we've talked about this in the past, but also any credits that you're doing, say you're paying for a home warranty, repairs to a contractor, or you're doing credits to the buyer on the commission disbursement, B&O taxes owed on all of that as well. So the Department of Revenue is very clear the B&O tax is on what's earned, not necessarily what is received by the office. The only exception is when we as an office are paying referral fees and escrow itself is paying that other firm. So it could be a Remax in Nashville, right, that you received a listing referral for. As long as escrow pays that referral fee directly to them, then we don't pay B&O tax on that. Or it could be, say, a Windermere agent in Nevada sends you something, it'd be the same thing. As long as they're paid the referral fee from ESCO, then we don't pay the B&O tax. If we do it any other way, then we've got to pay the B&O tax on it. Okay, so let's go over the sample 41C. So hopefully you've got that pulled up on your screen. We'll go over how to fill that out. So as long as you're using the autofill within Transaction Desk, then it'll autofill the top lines as usual. So probably the most common box that you would need to check here would be the second one on line 9 for additional buyer brokerage firm compensation. So buyer is obligated to pay buyer brokerage firm compensation as a condition of a buyer representation agreement between buyer brokerage firm and buyer. Seller's offer of compensation to buyer brokerage firm in the listing is less than buyer's obligation to buyer brokerage firm. Accordingly, the seller agrees to pay buyer brokerage firm additional compensation of blank percentage of the sale price or blank dollar amount at closing. Buyer brokerage firm's total compensation paid by seller shall be blank % of sale price or blank dollars at closing. So I'll provide an example. Let's say I've set my minimum at 2.5% and this listing is at 2.25, like one I saw yesterday. So in that case, you would put on line 13 in the percentage box, seller agrees to pay buyer brokerage firm additional compensation of 0.25%, since that's the difference between the 2.5 I agreed to and the 2.25 in the listing, right? And then on line 14, buyer brokerage firm's total compensation paid by the seller shall be 2.5%. So I think that that's probably the most common way you would need to use this form. I'm going to say that anytime you're using this form for the first time, please let me know. I think it'd be good to if I'm not checking your contract, at least have some text communication about the compensation, just so we can at least discuss it via text and make sure you filled it out correctly. Because I can see how this could be easy to fill in the wrong numbers, and it's important that you get them right. So any questions about how to fill that out?
I have a question. It's not specifically about this, but I just thought of it. So if we are negotiating our commission as a part of the purchase and sales agreement, well, I guess, would it be a part of the purchase and sales agreement? Would you just put it in Form 21 set? Oh, you would check. I think I answered my own question. So you would put the percentage that you're trying to negotiate, and then rather than checking the box that says pay as offered, you would check the other,
Yeah.
and then it would
on Form 21, line 16, you're going to write, well, you'll have the buyer brokerage firm compensation offered and listing, in my example, would be 2.25%. But then you're going to check box other, see addendum.
Yep.
And then within your, at least right now, it's line 21. And I don't have that one in front of me, but the one that lists all the addenda, you're going to want to list your Form 41C. And then you would fill out the Form 41C like I just explained, where you would say seller agrees to pay buyer brokerage firm additional compensation of 0.25%. And then the total shall be 2.5%.
And then if you were negotiating that the seller pay more to increase, so because that example, oh wait, never mind. That is the seller agreeing to pay more.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I
I was
covered the one
reading
where
it as buyer. That makes more sense. Okay.
yeah. So the example I provided is if you agreed to a minimum of 2.5,
Yep.
and only 2.25 was in the listing offered as the buyer brokerage commission. So it will be listed as 2.25 on page 1. And then this is going to cover your base. This is the addendum where you're negotiating for that additional 0.25% for a total of 2.5%.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Any other questions? Okay.
Sorry, maybe you're going to go over this. I was just trying to skim Form 41C. In the case that you have the buyer pay the difference, so the buyer makes up the difference, say it's at 2.25%, you've agreed in your buyer agency agreement to 2.5%. If your buyer agrees to pay that extra 0.25%.
Yeah, that's right. Your question reminds me of a question that I had that didn't get answered yet, whether there's a form for that. And well, it wouldn't need to be in the purchase and sale agreement, because the purchase and sale agreement is really between the buyer and seller, right?
Right.
And so like when I did this before and my buyer paid a difference, I think I just reflected it on the commission disbursement form.
Okay. So
what-
you would
what-
just have to have the buyer agency agreement saying, because in that agreement, it will say, you know, the buyer agrees to pay the difference, basically, right?
Right.
To the 2.5%. And so that would be your contract saying that you are owed that from the buyer.
Right. And so that's the beauty and the reason of the whole buyer's agency agreement, is that when you really get that signed, then the buyer really is responsible for it. Ultimately, either it needs to be negotiated with the seller, or if it isn't, they're responsible, or you're walking, you know?
Yep.
And so I'm trying to think, I think when I dealt with that one, I sent escrow a copy of my buyer's agency agreement. And then on the commission disbursement form, I had, and this is what I would be taking care of for you guys anyways, but just so you're aware, I put on there, because the listing firm fills it out and then it states what you're going to be getting from them, right? So it'd be 2.25 from them, and then it'd be 0.25 from the buyers.
Okay. So really, the seller doesn't need to know. If, say, the buyer is like, I don't even want to bother negotiating this with the seller, I would just rather, as the buyer, pay you the difference, right? Because some buyers might say that if they're in the position to. So in that case, the seller doesn't even need to know that the buyer's agent is getting any more compensation than what they're offering in the
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I would always at least ask and try to negotiate it with the seller, though. And this brings up something that I've been a little bit confused on, because I guess Annie didn't really have a set answer either way, but there was definitely disagreement amongst owners and brokers as to how this should be handled. Some were like myself, and they're like, well, just call the listing broker, right? And say, hey, I have a buyer's agency agreement at 2.5. I mean, and this is what I did in the past. I have a buyer's agency agreement at 2.5. I think it was at 2. And so there's a half difference. And so I thought, before I write an offer, can I attempt to negotiate with the seller? Is there any room? This agent was not really cooperative, but who knows what was really going on, but she's like, nope, there is no room. That's the way it is. The sellers need to net this amount or they're not going to sell. So I was like, okay. And that was a phone conversation, because I think those things are usually good to have over the phone. So then I either called my buyers or I texted them that response and let them know, hey, I just talked to the listing broker. This was the response. So I could still try to ask for it, but I don't think that's going to go over well. You said you can pay the difference. So what do you want to do? And they were like, we'll just pay the difference.
Yep.
They really wanted the house. So then that's how it happened.
Okay.
But there is difference of opinion. Like, some think that you shouldn't necessarily be talking to the listing agent first. It kind of seems like Annie was weighing with perhaps the majority of us that, well, it's not going to hurt.
Right.
Like, communication's usually only a good thing. You might as well at least ask,
Right.
and then share the answer with your buyer, and it's their decision what to do, but you may as well ask.
Yep.
So that's how I plan to proceed, unless I hear something different. And that's where, I guess I'll warn everybody here at this point, this is all in an effort to try to help the new forms next week go over smoothly. We've obviously, attorneys and everyone has tried to predict how this is going to go, but we don't really know how it's going to go. After a few weeks or after a few months, who knows, some new things may pop up. And so obviously it'll be my job to just keep you all updated of stuff, either during office meetings, or if another agent development's necessary would be helpful, we'll do that. Things can always change. But as of right now, I think I'm always a fan of communicating. And that's where but I think both of you understand too, every situation is different, right? Like, I know I've in the past worked with some listing brokers that don't ever answer their phone and hardly respond to texts. Well, then maybe that's not going to work, And so that's where I'm just always here to provide support and advice too. You can always explain the situation to me, and then I can kind of give you what I think might work best.
Yeah. I could see, I guess my thinking, why I was kind of asking these questions is because it seems like it could be a easy thing for a listing agent to kind of miss if they're just going through, if they're not well informed and paying close attention. Because so say they had a commission set to 2.25 and you were trying to negotiate it to 2.5. Well, on the Form 21, on that line 16, you would be putting 2.25. So the only difference would be that you're checking that other box and then you have that extra form. Well, if somebody wasn't super up to date on all of these changes and everything, and then they miss, they don't see, they just could see, okay, 2.25. Yeah, they agreed to 2.25, but really that other 0.25% is on 41C. So like, I wouldn't use it deceptively, but I could see that being, I don't know, I could see a not informed listing agent missing that and not communicating that to their seller. And then all of a sudden their seller is paying 0.25% more than they thought they were,
Yes. Yeah, technically that could happen. And that's where it's funny that you bring that up, because I think there's been more concern about it on the flip side about buyer's agents not having a clue what's going on. And I think because this is where it's even more common. I mean, I see this all the time. Like, yeah, I think I recently reviewed 2 offers and they were missing stuff and it was crazy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, in fact, I just reviewed one the other day. I'm like, what is going on with people? So that's where I think there's probably more risk of buyer's agents not paying attention to commission at all.
Yeah.
And just quickly filling in their forms. And we know they miss lines all the time or fill in things incorrectly.
Yeah.
And then just not getting paid or getting paid what they thought they were or whatever.
Yeah. And I guess that's always been a risk. It just is, it's just a different way to think about it now that these extra lines are on there. They're like really little changes, but I feel like they could potentially have big impact.
Yes.
If somebody wasn't using them correctly or paying attention. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Which is why, this was on the MLS homepage. There's been lots of emails and stuff about it. And really, like, I like the new MLS member site. Like, I feel like it's nicer to look at. The colors are nice. Yeah. It seems easy to navigate, but I don't like how there isn't that scrolling piece of news across the top anymore. Like, that's just gone.
Yeah.
And that was valuable. Like, I would check that. Those were the most important things to check for that week, so I missed that. But yeah, so I guess that is a reminder that, I try to keep you all up to date of everything going on, but who knows what other agents are doing out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, there could be other buyers agents or listing agents just going along, not even realizing that there's been changes,
Yeah.
So just be aware of that. Okay, so anything else before we move on to the buyer representation agreement? Okay, so several changes have been made to the buyer representation agreements. The first is to create separate forms for exclusive agency relationships and non-exclusive agency relationships. This will simplify the individual forms, yet the forms will reference one another to inform the parties of the existence of the other option. The compensation section of the forms has been clarified to separately address compensation paid by seller and compensation paid by buyer. The forms include a new section where if the compensation offered by seller is greater than the compensation agreed to by buyer, the parties may direct that portion of the compensation to the buyer brokerage firm, the buyer, or the seller. The tail provision, which obligates a buyer to pay compensation under certain circumstances after expiration of the agreement, will be revised to include a fill-in field for the length of the tail with a 6-month default. Note that similar revisions will be made to each buyer representation agreement. A new provision provides that the broker shall bring listings to the attention of the buyer regardless of the amount of seller's offer of compensation, unless otherwise agreed by the parties. Similarly, new Rule 106 provides that buyers shall not filter listings sent to buyers based upon the compensation offered to the buyer broker, unless specifically requested by the buyer in a written buyer representation agreement. So that's available on here. New Rule 106 also prohibits a broker from filtering listings sent to buyers based upon the listing firm or broker. And so we can go to the new Form 41 sample that we have, the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. We're just going to go over that because, of course, hopefully that's the one you're using. You would want to be a buyer's exclusive agent and be able to sell them hopefully anything that they purchase, right? I think the only reason that you might have a non-exclusive one where if for some reason a buyer were searching in two totally different areas within our state or something, and you are only servicing them for listings in a particular area. But again, that would be risky for you, right? Because then they might buy something in that different area and you're not even going to get compensated. So that's why hopefully you'll just be using the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. So the top and the first 4 paragraphs are going to be about the same. For areas, it's unlimited if you don't fill it in. So I would leave it blank unless for some reason your buyer wants to fill in specific areas. The term of the agreement defaults 120 days. That should also be adequate. So I would leave those the same. But then when you get down to paragraph 5 regarding compensation, this is where this buyer's agency agreement changes from the past one. So compensation, if buyer purchases, including a contract to purchase and exchange or contract to exchange or an option to purchase real property located in the area during the term, and the purchase closes or the purchase fails to close due to buyer's breach of the terms of the purchase and sale agreement, then buyers shall pay to buyer brokerage firm the compensation as follows. And so on line 22 is where you're going to check the box, most likely for a percentage amount, and set your minimum compensation. So then as an example, for my buyer's agency agreements, I'll be checking that box and putting in 2.5% for buyers. Now I would have talked to them about how I prefer to work for 3, but I can allow for some variance, so I can accept 2.5, but I'm not able to accept any less than 2.5. And I don't usually get into the percentages as far as the difference between 2.5 and 3, but like I was going to pull it up again. I think it's like 17%. 0.025 divided by, yeah, it's 17%. So sometimes I'll say, you know, I can work for 17% less, but not any more than that. And that's where most people understand that. Remember that, I guess I'll bring this up at this point. Some people view it as like, oh, well, I could work for 2, but if you're working for 2, that's really only 2/3, you know? So that's like the buyer's getting that, or you're working for 33%. So to me, that's where 2.5 is kind of my limit. I feel like I can continue to provide the same services that I want to provide to anyone else at that price, but anything less, then I would have to start figuring out, well, what am I not going to do for that person? And I haven't really had to have this conversation with the buyer, but I guess what I could say is I don't honestly know what I would not do for you. Like, I always give everyone my best, you know? So trying to work for less just doesn't work for me. So those are some possible things that you could say. Next. So lines 28 through 30 talk about if the seller's offer of compensation is equal to or greater than the above amount, buyers shall accept the seller's offer of compensation, and buyers shall not be obligated to pay buyer brokerage firm. Any amount of compensation offered by the seller that is greater than the above amount shall be, and this is where I would check that box on line 30, paid to buyer brokerage. But you could check the box on line 31 for credited to buyer and they have right here in parentheses, to the extent allowed by buyer's lender, because remember, it may not be allowed by the buyer's lender, and any non-allowable amount shall be paid to buyer brokerage firm. So that would be the default for that. Or you can check the box on line 32 for credited to the seller, if you're going to allow the seller to keep that overage, which would then increase the net of your offer. Or there's a box for other. There weren't really any examples provided of what you would do for other, but it's available. So any questions about the compensation part? Okay, I went over how I'm planning to use them, but let me know if either of you have any questions. So one of the things we talked about, one of the changes is filtering listings, right? So that's paragraph 5C, lines 39 and 40. Filtering listings. Buyer broker shall bring listings to the attention of buyer regardless of the amount of seller's offer of compensation, unless otherwise agreed is set forth herein. So that means that you aren't going to filter listings by compensation at all. You're going to show them everything. And so, and that's what I think we've all been doing all this time anyways. What I do is anytime a buyer sends me an MLS listing or an address, I go in and I check it, and kind of part of what I check in addition to showing information is the compensation. And then if it's lower than what we've agreed on, I let them know. And so then we have a plan before we even see the property. If for some reason they did want you to filter them out, like let's say they're a VA buyer and they just don't want to have to worry about negotiating with the seller or whatever. I mean, this could happen, right? As inventory increases and the market slows, maybe they just don't want to worry about that. Then you could check that box there for line 40 and write a description of how you are going to filter them. For paragraph 5D, I would leave that blank with the default. And that is all. So really the biggest thing is setting your minimum compensation on line 22, and then determining what's going to happen with an overage on line 30. So any questions? Okay, I know we're running over. I think it's because we had so much conversation in the beginning. Are you both good for about another 10 minutes?
Yep.
Okay, good. So lastly, we've got the listing agreements. So let's see, I already talked about kind of the past framework, why sellers were paying the listing firm and the listing firm was sharing, so we can skip that. The listing agreement is revised to provide new options for compensation to address transactions with when a buyer is unrepresented or when the listing broker acts as a dual agent. And I will say that really of all of the forms, it's kind of odd, but it's this listing agreement that has the most changes for sure. So this is probably what's most important because there's definitely big changes here. For these situations, the parties may want to agree to a different compensation amount. We'll go over that, how you can do that. The tail provision provides that if the seller sells the property after the expiration of the listing agreement to a person who became aware of the property through the efforts of the listing firm during the listing, the seller owes compensation. That was in there before, but now this tail provision will include a fill-in field where parties may agree to a length of the provision. 6 months is the default. The listing firm will then insert the length of the tail provision into the listing. Okay, so this is a new rule 101, and the listing agreement will provide that if a buyer brokerage firm notifies the listing firm or seller of its intent to submit an offer, any change in the published buyer brokerage firm's compensation thereafter shall not apply to that buyer brokerage firm, provided that the offer is submitted within 3 calendar days of such notice. So that's to protect buyers, agents, and their firms in case the seller's changing compensation amounts. There will also be a new option via checkbox included to give the seller the choice of whether the offer of compensation to the buyer's broker will apply to licensed brokerage firms that are not members of the MLS. Is one thing we didn't talk about yet is that there's also a movement for licensed brokers, at least within states that they're licensed, to be able to sell and have access to listings even if they aren't in the same MLS. It's a way to really create, I think, more of an open market and more competition that way. And so that's why this has been added to the listing agreement. Finally, the listing agreement will be revised to clarify that the seller owes compensation when the sale closes or if the sale fails due to the seller's breach of the purchase and sale agreement. So this is a big change to property access. New Rule 11H in the listing agreement will address access to the property by licensed brokers who are not members of the MLS. The rule provides that upon authorization from the seller, the listing firm shall facilitate access to the property for non-member licensed real estate brokers desiring to preview or show the property. Of course, providing access to the property with seller's permission to non-member licensed brokers is consistent with the broker's agency law duties to the seller. The listing agreement has been revised to give the seller the choice via checkbox whether to authorize the listing firm to provide access to the property to licensed brokers who are not members of the MLS. While this may not be a common occurrence in many areas, listing brokers may get these requests from time to time from non-member licensed brokers. The seller may also decide whether to require those brokers to sign an access agreement prior to any preview or showing. Note that NWMLS will publish an access agreement that sellers and listing brokers may use to address property access, property damage, liability, etc. Also note that the non-member broker will not have access to the key box, so the listing firm will need to coordinate and arrange access in another manner through the listing broker or seller. So I guess to try to explain all that, I kind of explained the purpose of all of that. But what could then happen is like an example is the Tri-Cities area. They are not members of the MLS. They have their own, it's called PAC. I don't even know what it stands for. But like, we could have an agent from that area. Maybe they have someone that's selling over there and wants to buy over here, right? So then our listing agreement would need to cover, okay, is that agent going to have access to the property or not? And if so, how are they going to have access? Because they don't have access to our super key boxes. So it's most likely going to require our presence to be there to allow them in. And so when we go over the sample listing agreement, we'll cover how that's going to work. But I just wanted to provide an example of how that might happen. And I don't necessarily think this is going to become a common thing, but with these rule changes, it could start to occur. So you want to be prepared for it. Other changes to the listing agreement include removing the seller representation related to boundary lines and encroachments, revising the indemnity related to seller's warranties and representations to apply to seller's right to sell and seller provided photographs, and adding an indemnity related to property damage and injury. The order of some of the paragraphs have also been revised to make the form easier to use. Okay, so let's just take a look at the new Form 1A, the exclusive sale listing agreement, and go through these. So the first 3 paragraphs are pretty similar to what they were before. It's paragraph 4, compensation, that you're going to look at and realize, oh my gosh, this is way different. So it now reads, if during the listing term seller sells the property and the sale closes, or the sale fails to close due to seller's breach of the terms of the purchase and sale agreement, meaning like they're under contract and then they all of a sudden decide they don't want to sell, right? Well, you've done your job. You marketed the property. You brought a willing and able buyer, right? So then technically they would owe our firm a commission. Sellers shall pay compensation as follows. And that reminds me of another thing, I guess, that we may not have talked about is everything used to be referred to as commissions. They're all now going to be referred to just as compensation rather than commission. So the first line 30, listing firm compensation, percentage of sale price, or blank dollar amount. So this is where you're going to put 3% or possibly 2% for you and RE/MAX leading, or sorry, 2.5% for you and RE/MAX leading professional. I saw your eyes go big, Jessica. I'm trying to get these numbers mixed up, man. Hopefully 3, maybe 2.5. Remember, 2.5 at the minimum. So then there's a new section under that, unrepresented buyer. If the buyer is not represented by a buyer brokerage firm, then the listing firm compensation shall be blank % of the sale price or blank dollar amount. Or it'll be equal to the amount in subsection 4A above, if not filled in. So this is a major difference because in the past, and I know I've had conversations with both of you and everybody about this. In the past, you could write up an offer for a buyer, not represent them, and automatically get paid the buyer brokerage commission, or both sides if you're the listing broker, right? That is now not the case by default. So you need to fill in your minimum amount of compensation on line 32, if you think that you may write up an offer for a buyer that is not represented on your listing. And the way this happens most often, and how it's happened for me, is you're the listing broker, you're holding your listing open, somebody comes in and who knows where they came from, but they've already done some research, whatever. This is the home they want to write an offer on, right? And this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen once in a while. They don't have an agent. They just need someone to write it up. So this is where you're going to want to set your compensation for that, because you're probably not going to want it to be the same as line 30, right? Because you're going to be doing more work. Although you aren't going to be showing that buyer homes, you are going to be writing the offer for them. You're going to be working with the seller on their behalf. You're not necessarily going to be negotiating for them, right? Because you're going to be facilitating a sale, but you're going to be doing the amount of work necessary for their side. You're also probably going to be attending their inspection, working on the appraisal, doing other things throughout the process. So that's why hopefully you wouldn't want to just do all that for your one fee as the listing broker, right? So that's where you've got to decide what it's worth. I would recommend putting in there something between 5 and 6%. I'm planning to put in 5 for mine, because I feel like if a buyer comes to me at an open house or they call me off the sign or whatever, well, at least I didn't have to show them property. And that's where for every agent, it's kind of different. But I always feel like showing homes is probably about 1/3 of their responsibility. 1/3 of it is all the contracts, all that sort of stuff. And then another 1/3 is just getting it to close and all the closing services, because remember, you're going to be the one to give the buyer the key. It's not going to be some other agent. So you're going to have all those duties. So I would recommend 5 to 6 there, because you're going to be doing more work. Do either of you have any questions about any of that? Okay. The next line, 34, paragraph B, buyer brokerage firm compensation. So that's going to be blank % of the sale price or blank dollar amount. This is what the buyer brokerage compensation will be in the listing. So this is where it has always been able to be a different amount than the listing firm. In fact, I know that there are some agents out there that would list things at 6%, and they would keep 3.5% for themselves and 2.5% to the buyer brokerage commission. I've never done that myself, and I don't ever plan to start, because we all see that final settlement statement at the end. And so if you're doing something uneven, it's going to be seen, and agents don't tend to like things when they're unfair like that. So I recommend offering the same amount to the buyer broker's firm as you're paying yourself. I think it's just most fair. So in that case, for me, I'm probably gonna be putting in 3%, or maybe I'm doing 2.5% if the majority of the listings in the CMA in Pierce County were a total of 5. Dual agency. So this is also a little bit different, because you've got to fill in what you're going to be paid as a dual agent. And of course, part of it's going to be based on what you seek as a buyer's agent, right? So paragraph 4BI, dual agency, lines 42 to 44, it says if the listing broker is a dual agent and represents both seller and buyer, then the buyer brokerage firm compensation paid to the listing firm shall be blank of the sale price. And that's because they wanted to leave it open to where maybe if you're a dual agent, you might possibly want to be compensated less. I know that there have been some cases where some agents do that. I never really have. If I'm a dual agent and I've been out working with a buyer and showing them homes, shouldn't I be compensated what I was looking to be compensated elsewhere? I don't understand why I would discount that. It's not like my work has really reduced any. So for me, that's going to be 3%.
Can you clarify the difference between what you were talking about in line 32? So if you weren't representing them, but you wrote an offer, Does that not make you a dual agent?
Yeah, weren't necessarily a dual agent.
Even though
You
you're
could,
performing agent duties for them by writing the offer and being there for the
no,
inspection?
because you were disclosing that you already represented the seller.
Okay, got
So
it.
remember, the way that buyer's agency works is that by default, you represent the buyer unless you represent the seller.
Okay,
So when you represent the seller and it's your listing already, you represent the seller. The
yeah,
only way you can technically be a dual agent and also represent the buyer is if you have a buyer's agency agreement with them. But the idea now is that as more of us have buyer's agency agreements out there, and perhaps by next year they're required by law, then we're all going to have these buyer's agency agreements in place too. And so there's actually the thought that there might be more dual agency occurring.
yeah.
It's a
So
possibility.
when, if in the future a buyer's agency agreement becomes required, then would you ever be able to just write an offer? You wouldn't, right? You would have to have a buyer agency agreement. You wouldn't be able to write an offer.
Well, no, you could represent if they're unrepresented. So a buyer could still be unrepresented.
Okay. So in that case, you wouldn't have to have a buyer's agency agreement with that buyer.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Because you could represent the seller and a buyer just come to you that doesn't have a buyer's agency agreement with anyone. And so then you can write up the offer for them.
Okay.
And that's where I'm saying, in that case, to me, it's fair that you're not paid your usual buyer's
Sure.
brokerage compensation of 2.5% or 3%, right? It might be less.
Yeah.
And that's why in my case, I provide an example of then the listing firm would just, because the buyer's not represented, there is no buyer brokerage compensation. So the listing firm compensation has to increase from 3%. You need to add on what you want to be paid to help the unrepresented buyer write the offer and close the deal, right? And so that's why I'm recommending like 5% for that.
Okay.
So it'd be your 3 plus 2.
Okay.
But then if you do have an agency agreement, and obviously, hopefully the chances of this are slim, right? Where you have a buyer's agency agreement with a buyer and then you list a home. So you represent the seller and then, oh, that's the perfect home for them. Well, in the dual agency, probably what you're going to want is just the buyer brokerage commission that you are willing to offer a buyer broker, right? So that's going to be your 3 or your 2.5, whatever it was you had set above.
Yeah.
So any other questions about those options? So again, I think before either of you or anyone completes a listing agreement for the first time now, I know usually I just go fill them out, but we got to be careful on how we complete this now. And it'd be good for us to talk about what your plan is and for me to review it and make sure that you're setting it up the way that you intend it to be.
Yep.
Line 45 near the bottom, non-member buyer brokerage firm. If checked, the offer to pay buyer brokerage firm compensation shall extend to licensed brokerage firms that are not members of the MLS. I would check that box because again, that's just like, why not, right? If there's some other agent from Yakima that has a buyer, sure, I'll help let them in and they can earn a commission, just more exposure, more buyers for your seller. But technically it's a decision that the seller needs to make. So that's why that box is there. Okay, lastly, paragraph 5 on page 2 is one of the new ones that we discussed. So it's line 60 through 65 about property access and key boxes for non-member brokers. So listing firm may be contacted by licensed brokers who are not members of the MLS and do not have access to the key box on the property. Seller authorizes or does not authorize a firm to provide access to the property to licensed brokers who are not members of the MLS. So this is where, again, it's up to you and the seller, but I would be checking seller authorizes. firm to provide access to the property. And then on line 63, if authorized, listing firm shall or shall not be required to attend any such showing. It's probably best that we be there, right? We're going to probably need to let them into the key box anyways. And then if authorized, listing firm shall or shall not require brokers who are not members of the MLS to execute an access agreement prior to any showing. Right now, I'm recommending that we check shall. However, I have not seen this form that they are proposing yet. I do not see it anywhere, but I'm assuming that it's going to be good and probably advised, because it's going to probably cover things that are similar to like the pre-inspection form, right? Like there's no agreement. So it's hereby agreed on this form that if the buyer and their agent cause any damage and a repair is needed, that it's their responsibility, right? Like you would want a broker and buyer to agree to that. So that's why I think I would check the shall box on that, but we don't have that form available yet. So I guess as review, I would check seller authorizes firm to provide access to the property to licensed brokers who are not members of the MLS. And if authorized, the listing firm shall be required to attend any such showing, so you can let them in, provide oversight. And if authorized, listing firm shall require brokers who are not members of the MLS to execute an access agreement prior to any showing. Any questions about any of that? Okay, good. So that covers the Form 1A. I guess we'll finish up with our conclusion. And I'm sorry, this ran much longer than I thought. The revised rules and forms are currently available for review, as you've seen. So after today, feel free to take a look at them. Let me know if you have any questions before Monday or anytime afterwards. They're going to be published for use on October 3rd. I will check our office templates and things, but I'm assuming everything's going to be updated there as they've been in the past. The deferred implementation, because remember, this was all provided to us a month ago, has been intended to give us time to adjust our policies and practices. We need to start using all of these forms beginning October 3rd. So they talk about how members should use the new forms, including the revised purchase and sale agreements, listing agreements, a new listing agreement addendum, buyer representation agreements, and buyer brokerage firm compensation addendum. This includes writing offers on existing listings with the revised purchase and sale agreement. For existing listing agreements and pending sales, there is no need to update to the new forms. So you don't need to change anything from the past, just moving forward, beginning on Monday, start using the new forms. Any questions?
Nope.
Jessica? Okay, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.